Here we go. Roll video.
I think anybody creating something new must have an adventure.
It's not cinema, it's something else.
My advice to a young filmmaker is to make a movie every week.
The whole bag of movies can be learned in about a day and a half.
But suspense is essentially an emotional process.
You gotta make films. You gotta make it and get it seen.
Cinema for me is a world of when I dream.
Welcome to Behind the Slate. I am your host, Aaron Strand. I hope you have enjoyed our Melvin Van Peebles series, in which we talked about the life of one of cinema's most revolutionary artists, but also discussed the long and complicated history of Black representation in American drama. But when it comes to more recent history around this subject, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome an illustrious guest. Jonathan Braylock is an actor, writer, producer, and comedian. And we knew each other over 10 years ago when we were both NYU acting students at the Stella Adler studio. But he has since gone on to act in shows like Unbreakable Kimmy, Schmidt, and Broad City, as well as commercials and feature films. He is an acclaimed writer working on shows like Grownish and developing projects with Ramy, Youssef, and Judd Apatow. He is the co-creator and co-writer of the first all-Black improv team at Upright Citizens Brigade Theater called Astronomy Club, which was then later adapted into a sketch show on Netflix. And he is the co-host of the fabulous podcast Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood, along with Jerah, Milligan, and James III, which reviews films with leading Black actors and discusses them in the context of Hollywood's race problem. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Braylock.
Wow. This is definitely what it feels like to be on NPR, I think. I feel like if I was if I was a guest on NPR, it would be something to that, because they're very good at building people up, and you did that thank you so much. That was a very nice.
Except I work really hard to not have like Ira Glass voice, and I go and not going up at the end of my sentences.
Oh no, I tapped into a trigger.
Jonathan Braylock is an actor, writer, producer, and comedian. We knew each other over 10 years ago.
It's just like such a distinct and pleasant voice to listen to, but yes, you don't. It's like how do I not imitate that?
It's fine. It's totally fine for him. I love him doing his thing, right. But it's the spread of the voice, Yeah. So, but I'll take it. I'll take the compliment.
Yes. I more meant in the phrasing, not in the tonation of Ira Glass, but I apologize if I was saying something that you were actively trying not to do.
Yeah, I'm not triggered at all. Jonathan. I'm totally cool. I can totally proceed with this interview. Anyway, it's great to see you. I mean, we haven't seen each other in 12 years, and even when we did...
Don't say that. Is that true? Holy crap, man. It's so crazy.
Yeah,
oh,
bro.
Man, we are old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have this amazing podcast, and I was reading a little bit about it. So this podcast, it started ironically with an argument on Facebook. Possibly This is the most productive argument that has ever happened on Facebook, because it has led to this amazing podcast. So tell me, what was the initial argument?
Yeah. So the initial argument was James III, my co-host and friend, made a post that basically questioned why Martin Lawrence didn't become a bigger household name after the movie Blue Streak. Now, if you aren't familiar with the movie Blue Streak, you're a normal person, and it's because it's a very mediocre comedy starring Martin Lawrence and Luke Wilson. It's a buddy cop film. The premise of it is essentially Martin Lawrence is a jewel thief who hid diamonds in a building before getting caught. And then once he finally serves his time and comes out of jail, he goes back to the place where he hid the diamonds and realizes that place is now in fact a police station. And therefore he's going to pretend to be a cop from out of town to try and get those diamonds back, and then winds up getting kind of looped into an active crime investigation. It's
Great premise.
it's a lot, a truly wild premise, and it's fine. And basically, James III's point was that Martin Lawrence was very, very good in the movie, and he wanted him to be a bigger household name. I then started arguing with him that he was a very big household name, and that the movie Big Mama's House came out after Blue Streak, and that's arguably that is an extremely popular film that spawned a sequel and made a lot of money. And then, of course, a lot of people know Martin Lawrence from the Bad Boys franchise.
Bad Boys, yeah.
You know, so I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. But it basically that. Because we were arguing back and forth, that kind of dovetailed into this conversation, because we were saying Martin Lawrence was one of the biggest Black actors in Hollywood at the time. It kind of dovetailed into this conversation of, wow, there aren't a lot of leading Black actors in Hollywood. You know, there are, especially at that time, there was like a handful that, you know, like you had Will Smith, Denzel Washington, you have comedians like Martin Lawrence and Jamie Foxx, who also wound up doing drama. And, you know, there weren't that many Black actors that were consistently leading the leads of major motion pictures. And so that's, you know, I had always wanted to do a podcast. I love movies. I love talking about movies. It seemed like a great kind of angle to start with. And then as we did it, we realized, whoa, there's so much here. And we honestly ourselves learned a lot by doing the podcast. And we've been doing it now for 8 years.
8 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's crazy. You've literally covered hundreds of films in that span. What are some of the highlight films from that 7 years? Like, as you look, or 8 year span, what, as you look back, what are pops into your mind of like, oh, that was a good one. I'm so glad we covered that.
So like early on, you know, we covered the film Blazing Saddles, which was a very contentious episode because Jerah, our other co-host, actively disliked the movie because he didn't feel he felt like Blackness was being used in a way that like it didn't feel good to him for comedy. And my argument was that it was pretty, you know, progressive for the time that it was created, even though it was still created by Mel Brooks, a Jewish white man. So that's like that episode is kind of sticks out in my mind as like it kind of set the tone for like what our dynamics became and like who our kind of like caricatures became on the podcast. But we've done so many good ones. I mean, we've had like the Black Panther episode was so fun. The Star Wars Force Awakens. We've had some really like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Like those three in particular were very joyous episodes where we got to celebrate these like kind of what felt like at the time very significant moments in Black, you know, cinema, where there was like a kind of a crossover happening. But then then there were certain movies like Green Book or the somewhat contentious Hidden Figures, or there are certain movies where we were like, is this fully helping, like, or is it like this kind of polished version of racism that makes white people feel good about themselves but not actually actively change anything in their lives because it kind of depicts racism as this thing that happened in the past that we've gotten over. So we have episodes like that, and then there are just like kind of very silly fun episodes like Cats, you know, where we're just like, what is this movie, and we're just kind of talking about the movie itself, not necessarily talking about race as much.
Cats needs to be discussed on every film podcast, I believe, as a true like aberration gem of modern cinema. Release the butthole cut. I feel like you might have already answered this question with Green Book and Hidden Figures, but were there episodes in particular, or maybe those were the episodes where you're kind of realizing to yourself like, oh, this is why we need to have these conversations, or like, this is why this show exists?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, so movies like, okay, let's take Glory, for instance, which I think we did review, but we were debating whether or not we should even review it, because Glory is a movie about the Civil War. It's specifically about this I don't know if they were the first black regiment, but I don't think so. I don't think they were the Buffalo Soldiers, but it's about this regiment in the Civil War of like all black soldiers that wound up. Spoiler alert for Glory, which has been out for decades now, and if you haven't seen it, that's kind of wild. But at the end, like they basically are kind of assigned to this suicide mission, and most of them wind up perishing in battle, but in a very kind of heroic way. And that movie kind of famously has the performance of Denzel Washington with a single kind of tear that won him his first Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. However, the movie stars Matthew Broderick. He is the lead of that film. And because Matthew Broderick is white, and, you know, he was I forgot what rank, lieutenant or whatever of the regiment, we're seeing the movie through his eyes. So we're seeing a black story told through the eyes of a white man. And we realize how often that happened in cinema. And what that does is constantly frames race through a white lens. Even stories where black people are the heroes is still being told through a white lens, and I don't even just mean the writer and the director. I'm saying like the story itself is told through the protagonist of a white protagonist character. You know, so you have movies like, and these aren't movies that we cover, but like you have movies like The Help, you know, or honestly Green Book, which we did cover. Or even like Dangerous Minds, you know. So you have these films that star a lot of people of color, where people of color, it's like it's really about their world, it's their stories, but there's a white protagonist character that's there, usually as a kind of savior, like a white savior character. So that's like one of the tropes that we talk about a lot in the movie, in the podcast, where in movies you have these white savior tropes, these white characters who realize racism is happening and they're going to do something about it and help, you know, the black people or people of color through their crisis. But it makes them the heroes of POC stories. So yeah, that I feel like I just answered the question, even though I forgot what the question was.
No, totally. Yeah. I mean, talking about like why these conversations are important. I mean,
right.
Which is like, I mean, it's kind of self-evident. I mean, just like look around the culture. But at the same time, I think that like getting down, that is really informative. And it goes all the way back to like the original like Harriet Beecher Stowe Uncle Tom's Cabin novel, where like Uncle Tom like dies this quote unquote like noble like Christian death, but like it's totally mediated through the white characters and just
right. Absolutely. And it's so crazy to me because like, so you say that, right? And it's like, that is true. And for the time that, you know, not that this should have been the way, but like for the time that was made, where literally slavery existed in America.
Right.
And you had these kind of very predominantly Christian abolitionists, white abolitionists trying to eradicate slavery, you know, that play makes sense for that time. What doesn't make sense is that we're still telling those kinds of stories that were written in the 1800s in the 21st century. You know, like that's the thing that you're like, what? Like, and you realize how deep this is embedded in our culture. And then it's funny because I think a lot of people like, because woke became this like maligned kind of term and easy way to like, you know, I don't know, put a huge kind of umbrella label over a lot of different things that the right disagrees with. It's easy for people to forget why stories about POC characters written by POCs and, you know, told through actual POC like protagonists is important. But it is.
How has your perspective changed on representation in Hollywood over the course of the show? And also like, because your career is also like progressing as the show happened. So how has that evolution, like when you think back to your first episode and how you viewed the world and culture then, how has it changed at all today?
Yeah, I think one, I feel like, representation was something that felt important, but I understood it more, and I understood the importance of it more as we did the podcast. I think one of the things that it's hard to understand because we're in it is how much movies and television affect the general zeitgeist and like kind of our collective consciousness. And because American entertainment is so global, at this point, because our movies and our television shows are viewed in so many other parts of the world, it actually affects like not just our country but other people's perceptions of the world in general. So it's not this isn't exclusive to race. It's just that when you're talking about in the context of race, it really informs what people think about, in the case of our podcast, very specifically Black Americans. And it's hard to shake those things from our subconscious because it's maybe unintentionally, though sometimes it feels like intentionally, training us to view people a certain way. It's training us to, I think about like how kind of pro military and pro cop like most of film and television was for forever until only maybe extremely recently. And even then there's still a lot of shows that are very pro military and pro cop. And this isn't to say anything bad against the people with those professions, but it does paint a certain picture of the military and police as like ultimate authority. These are the good guys, even when they're doing something quote unquote bad, they're still doing it for the right reasons, unless they're a really, really bad guy. And if they're a really, really bad crooked cop, then the good cops will take that crooked cop and oust them because good prevails over evil, which is kind of a basic human thing that we want to see. But because we are so trained in that, it's so hard for people to then divorce themselves from the kind of imagined world of the good cop hero, and realize the reality of, hey, there are a lot of very flawed police officers who themselves have been trained to view Black people as, dangerous and a threat. And then you pair that with a gun and a stressful situation, you get the killing of unarmed Black men, it's not a stretch to say those things are connected. And I feel like the more we went through the podcast, the more we realized how affected we had been just growing up and like, and seeing things a certain way and realize why it was so important. So it was like, it went from just like kind of like a general, like, yeah, Black people should be in movies more, like, to, oh, this is really important, for us, because this is like how we train each other how to like see the world. Like we do that through entertainment because most of us consume it.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think it's a brilliant point. And like the vast majority of our experience of reality is concocted in our imagination. And when our imagination is being affected by artistic works and shaped by artistic works, like, I mean, of course it's going to have a huge effect. Now I'm curious, this journey and that sort of like shift that you went on. So when you are starting a project or when you're working on a script or on in development, what are some of the ways that you apply that understanding and knowledge to your own work, both in sort of like both the characters or casting choices that are being represented in your films and like sort of how you're crafting those representations?
Yeah, I think, the first is the awareness of where my inclination is to go when I'm writing a character. I think like it's the default because of growing up in a world dominated by like a white heterosexual patriarchy. Like when I'm like, there are certain characters, like even smaller characters I'm writing, and I'm like, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, this guy says this. And then it's like, wait, why did I make that character a man? Like, why couldn't that character have been a woman? And then I'm realizing, oh, when I'm writing female characters, it's like, I think one of the things I realized in comedy, and I mean, many women have said this, this isn't me just coming up with it on my own. A lot of times, especially if you watch like films in like 80s, even 90s, probably even the early 2000s, honestly, like so many of the female characters written in comedies are either the love interest, or like the mother, or or they'll be like the girlfriend who is like the person of reason, who's kind of like, you crazy, like stop being so crazy, especially in television, that's like a very standard trope of like the dad is like the comedic guy, and then the woman's like, oh, my bum husband, like kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like a shrew, essentially, which dates obviously back to Shakespeare, speaking of our training at Adler. But yeah, so it's kind of like understanding those and recognizing those trends, and then realizing when it's popping up in my own writing and going like, oh, let me not do that. Let me make sure that this character has depth. Let me make sure that we're giving female roles funny lines that aren't just like, you're so crazy, wacky guy. And yeah, and then like breaking the mold when it comes to diversity, when it comes to what ethnicity or race the person's playing, when it comes to what sexuality they are. And then, the project that Judd, Ramy, and I have been developing is with our friend Steve Way, who has muscular dystrophy and is wheelchair bound. And, that's a huge thing in television is, there's not a lot of disabled representation, even though like it's the largest minority group in America is people living with some sort of disability, whether it be physical or mental, or it could be an invisible disability. But there are a lot of people living with disabilities, and that isn't seen often. And then there's this whole world that we're missing, that is fun to explore. And then realizing that those people are also people, and they're not like in the world of like Hollywood. There are a lot of characters who have a disability that are kind of used as like inspiration porn. Like it's like, well, if this person can do it, so can you, able-bodied person. They're used as like the way to motivate the able-bodied protagonist, as opposed to just being a person who also has flaws, and maybe isn't a role model, like is just trying to get through life. So yeah, anyway, those are some of the ways that affects my writing.
Is there another side to it? Because I think, I feel like sometimes you can also feel, especially like getting sides from some of the bigger budget projects, where you almost like feel production almost like having kind of like a checklist that they're like going through of like making sure they like check their diversity boxes. How do you sort of make sure your work stays sort of true and like more honest than that?
Yeah. I mean, that's tough. I don't know. Because there is I will say, I do think sometimes people get bogged down into doing exactly what you're saying, which is like, I feel like that's how like, like, do you remember like the Super Friends? Like there was like a period of time in Hollywood where like, it would be like, hey, let's get the colors of the rainbow in here. Like we'll have our one black person and our one Hispanic person and our one Native American. And, there's, more recently, like we'll have our one gay character. But what happens with that is that they get kind of stuck into these tropes. So like there's always the gay best friend, or like the black sidekick who's maybe like a magical Negro type of character where they're like, departing some wisdom to the white protagonist, or, so we don't want to do that. I think it's more just like reflecting our everyday life. And I will say that does mean that there are going to be some stories where there isn't a load of diversity in a particular film. And I don't think there are very few people, I shouldn't say no one, but most of the people advocating for diversity are not advocating for there to be like a set number of diverse characters in a film. What they're advocating for is that Hollywood's like would break the mold and break kind of the default like lines of thinking like only this type of person can play this type of role. Like only a white man can be the action hero. Like that's just not true. It's not reflective of real life, and it certainly shouldn't be reflective of our imagination. But that doesn't mean that we can't tell, a story. I mean, and of course that people do this anyway, but like it doesn't mean that you can't tell a story that is like, hey, this story is about exclusively like white men working in, I don't know, in whatever, some period of time and like coal mines or something. I don't know. But like and look, I mean, there's always a way. I mean, this is just a side tangent. Like whenever you're pitching, if you ever enter the world of writing and pitching in film and television, period pieces are something they always tell you, like, don't do that because it's so hard to greenlight these because of how much it costs. It costs so much for them to do the costumes and the sets and all that stuff. So like period pieces cost a lot of money. We don't want to hear period pieces. But there are so many period television shows and movies being made. And I guess it's not really a conspiracy theory, but I feel like, oh yeah, that's because it's the easiest way to have like all white casts and like nobody can say anything about it. You're like, well, that's what the time was, and you're like, all right, yeah, I guess you're right. Like 1923, like that's what it is. What can we say? You're like, yeah, sure. It's like, yeah, okay, good one. But anyway, to answer your question, it's more just kind of trying to reflect real life and not just kind of go outside the box in traditional thinking without feeling the need to make a checklist, because that ultimately I'm a black man. I'm going to be telling stories. It's always going to come through my lens. I don't want that to limit me to the characters that I write. But if it's like a story that's very much centered, sorry, my dogs are barking, very much centered around a specific, like I'm not going to write a story of, like, I'm not going to write a movie about goodness, I'm blanking on his name. Black gay activist. I am not your Negro.
James Baldwin. Yeah.
James Baldwin. Right. So like if there's a biopic about, you can leave all that in. If there's a biopic about James Baldwin and somebody says, John, can you write this? I'd be like, I think maybe you should find a gay black man to write this, because that story is so precious, however, that doesn't mean that I can never write it doesn't mean that I will never write a script about where there is a gay black protagonist. It's just not maybe that particular one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, totally. Totally. I definitely agree. I think in the course of this series, and one of our other guests, Dr. Amy Ongiri, brought up the fact that like the blaxploitation film movement of the 70s sort of died and gave way to the buddy cop movie.
Yep,
where the
like Blue Streak.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And like they, the executives realized, well, instead of an all black cast movie, we can have a black guy and a white guy in a buddy movie, and both audiences will come. And not to say there's anything wrong with a buddy movie, or that like there can be a black and white man or woman or whatever.
But it had to be that. Yeah.
Right. But like you feel the capitalist like forces like conforming your brain, which is like a whole other level of brainwashing that we're getting from our entertainment.
Right. Totally. And that's the thing, is that, I mean, so much of Hollywood is monkey see, monkey do. And yes, they find the success. They find like there's a film that works, like Beverly Hills Cop, which is, one of the highest grossing rated R movies of all time. And like, and that wasn't even so much a buddy cop. I mean, he had white partners, but I mean, he also did, Eddie Murphy also did 48 Hours, which was actually a buddy cop movie. And then they're like, oh well, this works so much, let's keep doing it. So we get Lethal Weapon, and we get I'm blanking on the name of this, but there's one with he hosted the Oscars, Billy Crystal. Okay,
Billy Crystal. Okay, we got one.
We have Billy Crystal. And
is it Running Scared?
Yes, Running Scared. Yes.
I went to Google for that one. I can't claim credit for that
Yes. Running Scared, Billy Crystal and Gregory Hines. That's the name I was blanking on. I was like, he's a dancer. What's his name? Anyway, there are so many of those movies, and most people probably haven't seen Running Scared, but that's just to say, like, there are so many tropes that you start to find, and then people just come to expect that. They're like, all right, well, yeah, if you want a black person to lead, like, we'll have a white person be the buddy, you know?
Going back, kind of, I'm curious about your own film history, or your own sort of movie watching history.
Sure.
So Melvin Van Peebles, he has this quote about going to the movies as a little boy. And this is like the 1940s, right? And he's going into the movie theater and seeing films with like Manton Moreland and Stepin Fetchit and like these grotesque representations of African-American men on screen. And he describes leaving the theater, but he was young and didn't know why he felt worse than when he went in. I'm curious, is there a moment in your own childhood when you remember feeling that the representation you saw on screen like just felt wrong? Like was there a moment of awareness for you?
You know, it's hard because the 90s it's so funny. The 90s, which is kind of the era that I grew up as a kid, had a lot of representation. It was somewhat segregated at times, you know. There was a lot of like black films that were very much targeted to black audiences, but we had that. And we also had UPN, which was, you know, a network like free network television that had a lot of black content. You know, it had shows like Sister Sister and Girlfriends and Moesha and The Parkers. You know, you had a lot of like black sitcoms on television. And then, you know, then you had other shows like, you know, Cosby Show and like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And like, so like growing up on television, I actually did feel represented. There were I think the times in which I felt like slightly weird is when there were things like the Power Rangers, where it was like, well, I have to be the Black Power Ranger because I'm black. You know what I mean? Or like, this is more my sister, but like when you had the Spice Girls, it was like she had to be Scary Spice because she was black, you know? So when you have and then like, or like, I think the clearest one was Star Wars, because it was like, oh, I have to be Lando Calrissian. You know, everybody gets to be like, this person's like Luke, a Jedi, or what, Han Solo, you know, and then it's like, oh, you can be Lando, you know, because you're black. So like, I think there were those things. But I feel like weirdly, a lot of millennials who grew up in the 90s had more representation than either the late millennials, very early Gen Z did in the early 2000s, because a lot of those sitcoms went away. UPN went away. There weren't as many black films like being made or like targeted towards black audiences. Like that kind of like those like kind of niche like studios felt like they were probably getting gobbled up by the big conglomerates that we have now. And so then there was like a point where you were like, it was like, oh, there's very, very, very few black people on TV and very few black people leading movies. It's like the same, you know, handful. You had like the mega stars like Will Smith and Denzel, and then very rarely ever had like, or if you did have one, you had somebody star in one movie and then you'd never see them again, you know, or they would only show up in films that were targeted towards black audiences. And those films themselves started to just be like these huge cast films, you know, where it was like there's like 10 actors and you're like, oh my god, this is a star-studded cast, but they're all working black actors who only mostly the black community knows. And you know, I remember when Taraji P. Henson was nominated for Hustle and Flow. I forgot when she gave this speech, but she gave a speech, you know, like I think it was at the Oscar, maybe he was presenting or something. At some point she was like, oh, for white America, like, hello, you know, like you probably don't know me, but I've been doing movies and television for quite some time, you know, and that's just kind of how it was.
Do you have an answer as to like why that like cycle seemed to like take place at that time?
Well, you know what it is? I think there was this boom that happened that was somewhat synonymous with rap. So like kind of rap exploded and became this like hugely profitable commercial venture. A lot, if you go back and look at a lot of the so-called like hood films and that era where, you know, there were a lot of films being made that showed the inner city life. You had a lot of rappers starring in those movies. And I feel like Hollywood producers felt like, I don't know, we're not necessarily going to cast Black trained actors, but we will cast this rapper because they are a household name and therefore, you know, can promote our film in a certain way. So, and look, some of those actors wound up being great. You know, like Ice Cube made a lane for himself, and you know, Will Smith is one of my favorite actors, and you know, you had some cool stuff come out of that, but it was very much like that's what it was. You know, like DMX was starring in movies,
Right.
you know,
Right.
like he wasn't a good actor. You know, may he rest in peace, but he got to be because he was a very popular rapper. So yeah, I think I think like as the kind of novelty of that started to go away, they weren't being made as much. And then, you know, there is kind of, I mean, maybe not anymore necessarily, but there was very much like a TV to film pipeline, you know. So if you start in a television show there and you were like the lead of a big time television show, like you got a crack at the movies, you know. And Will obviously got to do that with Fresh Prince, and then he's got to started to star in movies. But when you take away the television shows that Black actors got to star in, and audiences kind of familiarize themselves with an actor and their face, then it's harder for Black actors, those people, to be cast in higher roles, and it's like a trickle down effect, you know. I don't really know the kind of the actual film history of like when certain studios were bought by now like parent companies and stuff, but I know that was happening, and it's at a point now where, you know, basically like most studios are like, there's like seven actual studios, and like every other name that you hear is actually just a smaller branch of another studio, because even the big studios have their indie labels that are another name, but it's still owned by the same company.
Yeah, I think you can look it up on the internet where you can see a graph, and it's like these big globs of like parent companies like Disney or whatever, and all the little subset companies that they own. It's quite shocking to see how our media diet is controlled by 7 entities. Yeah. Pretty disturbing. But yeah, I would definitely imagine that would have an effect as well. So you're also the co-creator of the Netflix series Astronomy Club, which I mentioned in the bio, and it started off as the first all-Black team at Upright Citizens Brigade. Was that a conscious choice of you guys, or was it something that happened organically?
Yeah, so yeah, we were the first all-Black house team, and that distinction just means that we were... UCB had, you know, they could have like one-off shows, or, you know, people can get runs of their own show, but they had their Harold and Lloyd nights were their house teams, and it was by design. James III kind of was the one who called us all together, like the Black Avengers of improv, and he was like, assemble, and we all came forth. No, but yeah, there was like a brief moment in time where you could audition as a team. I think it was maybe the second year that was allowed, and James thought it would be really cool for there to be an all-Black house team. There had already been an all woman team, and so he probably was inspired by that. And yeah, we auditioned together, and we got put on a team together as a team. There was no guarantee that would happen, but it did. I think it was only like one of maybe 3 or 4 times that it ever happened where 8 people auditioned together and all got put on the same team. And we actually only lasted for a year before the artistic director at the time broke us up, but we wound up doing a sketch show together. And that sketch show that we did got a run at the theater, and that kind of spun into this digital series that we wound up doing with Comedy Central. And then we used videos of that as our kind of proof of concept for our own show, which we pitched to a few networks, but Netflix being one of them, and very fortunately was able to make it.
What an incredible story. I mean, just
Yeah.
like, that's amazing. And it's a great show. If you haven't seen it, check it out on
Thank
Netflix. I'm curious, like going all the way back to sort of like those early days within the improv comedy space, which has long been like a notoriously like white male space.
Right.
How did you feel, or even like collectively as a group, did you feel like a responsibility towards that representation? Or was it more sort of like, we're going to do what we do and people can either like it or not?
Before we auditioned, it was more about us trying to make space for ourselves, because essentially what was happening in the improv scene was what was already happening in the kind of greater television film landscape, which was like you were seeing less and less representation. Like representation actually was getting worse in media. And we weren't like, we were somewhat conscious of it, not as conscious as we are today, but it was like we were in it. We were like in the moment and like on the ground floor of that, being like, what? Like, oh yeah, like it was like kind of like a running joke that like there are like, a couple of Black people that are allowed to be in the, on the inside, and then like if one Black person left Herald Night, then it would be like, oh, there's a spot. There's the Black spot is open. You know what I mean? That's truly how it felt. So
Wow.
We were kind of making trying to make a space for ourselves. But once we did get upon the team, and it was pretty like synced up with what was happening, I think, in America at large, which was like there were more cries for representation and diversity. We were kind of like in the middle of that, and then very much felt a responsibility to both assist in that, but also like be good, and like show that, we like deserve to be here, and other people that look like us also deserve to be here.
I'm curious. One of the things that came up in the Melvin Van Peebles story was earlier on in his career, and he sort of changed his opinion about this later. But he early on published a manifesto in French, which he declared as a Black filmmaker the right to be ordinary.
Yeah,
and he's talking about this tension between being an artist and being a Black artist.
Sure.
How have you navigated or experienced this dynamic in your own work and career?
I love that. Like we actually talk about that. We talked about that in the episode of our very, very early episode of our podcast, where we did In the Heat of the Night. And we did that with Keegan-Michael Key, which was an awesome guest for us to get at the time. And he was amazing. And, and we talked about this trope of the extraordinary Negro, or excellent Negro, I think we called it. And
sorry to interrupt real quick, but that was a major sticking point for Melvin Van Peebles as well, because he wrote this manifesto the year after
that movie came out.
That movie came out, which was
wow.
That movie came out December 1967, and he hated. He just described like Sidney Poitier is a Black doctor who might as well walk on water, and he's marrying this pimply faced nobody.
Right? Yeah, like. I know, and that, I mean, goodness, the Green Book, very similar stuff. But yes, exactly. And it's like you have, basically it was like in order for a Black character to exist and people not think racist thoughts about them, they had to be perfect and they couldn't be flawed. And, that trope kind of existed. And there is a way in which a lot of Black people, and I've definitely felt this, and I know we felt this as Astronomy Club, and I know other people have felt it. Like there is a way in which you feel the pressure of having to be great to feel like you are deserving of anything, like a spot, and yeah, there's a lot of pressure that comes with that, and it's hard to just be ordinary. One of the things we talked about on the podcast is like, we'll review a film and we'll be like, this film was okay, and that's good. We should be able to have movies that star black actors, like black actors are the leads of, that are just fine. And those people get to continue to have careers because that happens with white actors all the time.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it shouldn't be that this person does one movie and it bombs and they're like, well, you can't sell a movie. It's like, I'm sorry. There are many other actors here that are not batting 1,000. So I don't know, not even to get into like the complicated reasons why a movie doesn't sell, and putting that on the one star of the movie doesn't actually make any sense.
No, it's a great point. And I'm curious, thinking back to like how, we first met, and we didn't know each other that well, like back in the day, but coming out of college, what did you imagine your career looking like?
I mean, I'll be honest, like I both simultaneously believed in myself and believed that I could make it in this industry, and also couldn't picture it happening. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to, because it's so, I didn't know anyone, like my parents couldn't be further removed from the entertainment industry, and like I didn't know anyone growing up really who was like that connected to it, so it was hard to envision it happening. It was very much like a dream and a passion, and so I didn't necessarily, I mean, I had like daydreams of being the star of movies and stuff like that, but I didn't necessarily have any like realistic expectations. That said, I never imagined one, that at a certain point in time I would feel like selling a television show that I was the creator of would feel easier than getting cast in a supporting role in a movie. But it has turned out that way. It's turned out the way that it feels harder to get. It feels like almost nearly impossible to get a recurring role in a television show than it does to just sell my own television show where I star and create it and I'm the boss of. I don't know why. I don't know how that is, but it is very real for me specifically. But
hey, I'm right there with you, man. Having achieved neither, the latter seems like the more feasible path.
Yeah.
As this incredibly successful multi-hyphenate artist, what is something that you think is misunderstood by people who are not in the industry?
I mean, that's such a broad category.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a million things that are misunderstood. But anything that comes to mind that like, that you think people who don't actively grind day in and day out in this job, that like you find that they just are unaware of.
I think, so in terms of acting, I think people are unaware of how long so many actors are at this, and how many things they've done before they've gotten to like a place of prominence. I feel like a lot of times people are like, oh, this new, actor. And sometimes it is like a young person who is starring in things for the first time. But a lot of times, like, you'll see someone and they'll pop, and then you go back and you realize like, oh, that person had this small role, like, 8 years ago in this movie that I saw, and I just never recognized them. So like, it is very much a grind, and people are hustling constantly. And also, it's not a meritocracy. I think maybe people do kind of know that, but it's tough. It's not necessarily that the best actor gets the job or the best writer gets the job. Again, people may subconsciously kind of know this, but not think about it actively. There are so many voices that go into anything that is made. And it's like the credit is usually like in film, it's like given to the director and maybe the main star of the film, or in a television show, it could be given to the showrunner or the main star. But there's like there are so many people and voices that going into that, and then so much oversight that kind of messes with the process. And so it is extremely difficult, even in this day and age where there's so much scripted content. It is still extremely difficult for anything to ever get done, and for it to be good. sometimes feels like a miracle.
I say it to my non-industry friends all the time. Like, just the fact that this is made and on your screen right now is, like you said, a miracle.
Yeah.
It truly is staggering. And the amount of things that can go wrong, it's just, even before like you even get to set, the number of things that can blow up your project and kill your dream and leave you to die on the vine is just truly staggering.
Yeah.
So, so you mentioned that this industry is not a meritocracy, which I could not agree more on. And this just occurred to me and popped into my head because it flies in the, it kind of is at odds with that myth of Black excellence in order to like have a seat at the table. It's like, you have to be great. You have to be the best. And yet the meritocracy is also a myth. And it the two ideas kind of like collide. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, well, I mean, I think I think that, what a lot of Black filmmakers and actors or writers would say is that those people who are successful really were so good, and they had to overcome so much just to even get a chance, and the reality is that is true. That is true regardless of your race. It's just that there's just this extra barrier because Hollywood, just like every industry, is runs on relationships and relationship building. And when there are like white producers or white writers or white actors, like those people know other white producers or white writers or white actors, and like there's friendships there, and like you get opportunities because of that. You get put into a movie because your friend is directing it, or this person gets to be on the crew, or this producer knows this writer and brings them in. Like that stuff happens all the time. And again, not that it necessarily shouldn't happen, but you can see how easy it is for diversity to not happen if you're not intentionally trying to put it in. I think that's one of the big misconceptions that a lot of people have. Maybe not anymore, but certainly growing up, we like this idea that like, well, if you stop being racist, then like racism will end and like the effects of it will end. It's like, no, you actually have to be intentional about pulling it out, because when you just leave it be, it's like, yeah, people are just going to be like, oh my God, we have an all white room. Why is that? Well, all these people are good writers, and maybe that's true, but you never even saw this other person's sample because they couldn't even get an agent, because you know what I mean? Or like you never heard of them because you asked for recommendations from your friends and they all knew the same pool of people.
I mean, I've as a white creator, I've experienced this blunder like personally, or like walked right into it, and with like the best of intentions of like, yeah, I'm just trying to like, like see the best actor available, and like, and it's been really eye-opening to even cover this series and just see the long, tired history of really dangerous decisions that people have made. And at times, like, not because, there's some sort of craven secret racist, but because they're just not thinking clearly. They're not thinking about the historical implications of what they're doing. They're not seeing how the structures and the long precedent of how things have been going back hundreds of years have like led to making a given decision in a creative space.
And I think ultimately people do want to believe in somewhat of a meritocracy, and so there's like a defensiveness that comes in when it's even pointed out, and it's like, well, what are you trying to say? Like, and like I think like Jon Stewart even experienced it. I remember at one point, where somebody said something, and he was I think it's like even someone people who consider themselves pretty progressive didn't realize the blind spots that they had. And even doing something like, oh, we're taking blind submissions. So we're really not, but it's like, okay, but you've been practiced in a certain form of comedy for so long, that is suited to your style. And you haven't even necessarily thought about this other way that people can be doing something. And therefore, your tastes are still going to be aligned, So even if you're doing a blind submission, it's not truly blind, like, until you realize that there are other ways that other people see things. And the fact that we were all kind of trained with this certain mindset growing up by films and television that we saw, you're not going to be able to undo it, just by, being quote unquote colorblind. I mean, it's complicated, but there's a lot there. It's just,
well, if you want to get into much deeper discussions, Jonathan and his co-hosts got it covered over on the Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood podcast, which comes out every week, correct?
Yeah, and it comes out every week. We might be changing the day in which it comes out. It currently comes out on Mondays, but I think we're going to change it to Wednesday. So perhaps we've already made this announcement on our podcast, but maybe not. If this podcast comes out tomorrow, you will hear it here first.
Luckily, there's literally hundreds of episodes you could go back and binge as you wait between Monday and Wednesday to find out for the next drop. Jonathan, do you have any where can people follow you, and do you have any upcoming work that you'd like to share?
You can follow me at John Braylock, JONBRAYLOCK, on Twitter and Instagram. I'm currently on strike because the WGA is on strike. If you haven't heard, go out and support. If we still are on strike by the time you're listening to this, amplify our voices. AMPTP needs to come to the negotiating table with fair and reasonable counters to our fair and reasonable demands. Anyway, but in terms of stuff you can watch, you can watch Astronomy Club on Netflix. Fifth season of Grownish is all out now. It's on Hulu. I think my specific episode that I wrote was the 5th episode, but I was a writer producer in all of them. If you are in Los Angeles, we have a monthly show that's the first Sunday of every month at the UCB Theater in Franklin, Franklin Ave in Los Angeles. And that's the first Sunday every month at 7 p.m. And it's called Black at the Movies. We just do improv based off of your favorite Black films. And it's very fun. It's a very fun show. And if you don't have a favorite Black films, you're racist, but that also is okay. That's okay. You can come and just sit and enjoy, and maybe learn a thing or two.
Yeah,
it's a cool fun. It's a cool. I fear we always fear that people listen to our sometimes listen to what our podcast is about, and they're like, I don't want to just be taught for 2. And it's like, no, we're talking about movies. We're having fun. These are movies that you watch and like, and then it's just our opinions on them. And every now and then we talk about the context of race and some serious stuff, but like it's it is very lighthearted.
It's edutainment.
It's exactly. It's not a freaking Ken Burns documentary, even though I find those very entertaining. We're cracking jokes constantly.
For sure. No, it's a fantastic podcast. Everybody should go check it out. Go check out all the shows. See the work that Jonathan deserves to be fairly compensated for, and stand in solidarity with the WGA.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And until next time, that's a wrap.